When my wife Eleanor died, I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye. But the real heartbreak came when my son Adrian chose a lavish masquerade ball over his own mother's funeral. In that moment, I realized he valued wealth status and his wife Celeste's desires more than family or respect for the woman who raised him. What followed was a battle between father and son that would strip away illusions, expose betrayal, and end with consequences Adrian never imagined. This story is not just about loss, but about justice, legacy, and the strength to take the final step when family loyalty is broken. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you back to the morning of Eleanor's funeral, where everything began to unravel. The morning of Eleanor Harlan's funeral arrived with a heavy sky pressing down on the coastal town. Gray clouds drifted over the sea and the waves rolled in slow, deliberate rhythms as if echoing the solemn occasion. I stood in front of the long mirror in my bedroom, fastening the last button of my black suit, my reflection a stranger who looked older than I remembered. My wife had always chosen my ties for events like this, insisting on a shade that matched her dress. Now, without her presence, I clutched a plain black tie that felt more like a noose than an accessory. My hands shook as I tightened the knot, and for a fleeting moment I wished I could hear her voice one last time, reminding me to breathe, telling me everything would be all right. The house was silent, yet filled with her memory. Every corner seemed to hum with echoes of her life, from the delicate seashells she had arranged on the mantel to the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the hallway. Even the kitchen bore her mark, with her teacup resting near the sink, a faint lipstick stain still visible along the rim. I had not moved it. I could not. I knew that when I returned from the funeral, it would still be there, a quiet reminder of everything I had lost. The silence pressed harder on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I looked at the clock. It was nearly time to leave. I dialed my son Adrian, hoping against reason that perhaps he had changed his mind overnight. The line rang several times before his groggy voice answered. In the background, I heard laughter, clinking glasses, and the muffled echo of music. For a moment, I thought I had misdialed, but then Celeste's high-pitched voice cut through shouting orders about decorations. I tightened my grip on the phone. Adrian cleared his throat and said he could not attend the funeral. His reason was simple, spoken as if it required no further explanation. It was Celeste's masquerade ball. They had been planning it for months. Guests were flying in from across the country. The catering was arranged. The orchestra was tuning their instruments. The words felt like ice water poured down my spine. I reminded him that his mother's funeral was that day. He responded with chilling calm. A masquerade happens only once a year. A funeral, he said, does not bring her back. I stood frozen in the quiet house phone, pressed against my ear, unable to speak. When Adrian hung up, the dial tone buzzed through the receiver, a sound so empty it made my stomach twist. I placed the phone back on its cradle and stared at Eleanor's reading glasses resting beside it. She had worn them every night while she sat in her chair by the fire, turning pages of her favorite novels. My hand trembled as I picked them up and then placed them gently back down. I could not imagine how she would feel knowing her son would rather wear a mask at a party than stand by her grave. By the time I arrived at the church, guests were already seated. The building, with its stone walls and tall stained glass windows, felt cavernous without her. Friends from the harbor, neighbors, members of Eleanor's charity group, all had gathered to honor her life. Faces turned toward me as I walked down the aisle alone, searching for the son who should have been there. His absence was like a black void that swallowed the air around me. I could hear the whispers begin to ripple through the pews. Where was Adrian? Why was he not at his mother's funeral? I sat in the front row, the casket resting only a few feet away, polished wood gleaming under the dim light. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat like a reminder of betrayal. Florence, Eleanor's sister, leaned close and whispered the question I had been dreading. Where is Adrian? I could not look her in the eyes. I murmured that he had important commitments. The words tasted bitter, like poison slipping off my tongue. She leaned back in her seat, shaking her head in disbelief. I could feel her silent judgment pressing into me. I kept my eyes fixed on the casket, refusing to let my emotions spill. I had to be strong, or at least appear to be. The service began, and the pastor spoke of family bonds, of eternal love, of the sacred duty children hold toward their parents. Each word pierced deeper, each phrase a reminder of what should have been. My gaze drifted toward the doorway one last time, foolishly hoping to see Adrian rushing in, mask in hand, realizing his mistake. But the door remained closed. He never came. As the choir sang and the congregation prayed, I felt the weight of solitude press harder against my shoulders. My son, the boy Eleanor, had defended until her last breath was gone in more ways than one. At the graveside, the air was sharp with the scent of salt and damp earth. The crowd stood in a semicircle as the casket was lowered into the ground. The pastor recited the final words of farewell. I clenched my fists as I listened to the dull thud of dirt striking the lid. Each sound felt like the shattering of trust, the burial not just of Eleanor but of everything I had believed about our family. I stood alone beside the grave as friends and neighbors offered condolences, their voices heavy with sympathy, but their eyes questioning. They all noticed the empty space where Adrian should have stood. They all understood without needing to ask. When the crowd dispersed, I remained. The cemetery grew quiet, except for the wind rustling through the tall grass. I traced the name carved into the headstone with my fingers. Eleanor Harland, beloved wife and mother. The stone was cold against my skin. I thought about the nights she had spent awake worrying about Adrian. She had always made excuses for him, insisting he was busy, that he was building his own life, that he cared more than he showed. I wanted to believe her, but the truth had been exposed in the cruelest way possible. Driving home, the streets of the town looked the same as they always had: neat houses lined with white fences, fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. But everything felt different. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, rage and sorrow boiling beneath the surface. The seat beside me was empty. The seat where Eleanor had always Saturday. She had loved taking the coastal road, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. She had always chosen the little details that made life brighter. Now the silence was unbearable. When I returned to the house, I paused at the front door, the key heavy in my hand. Opening it, I stepped into the void of silence once more. I hung my coat where she had always insisted it belong. I loosened my tie and collapsed into the armchair she had teased me about for years. Across from me, our wedding photograph smiled from the mantel. She in her lace dress, radiant at 23. I young and full of promise. I had kept my promise to her, given her everything I had. But now, with her gone, I wondered if we had given too much to our son. The evening stretched on. I walked through the halls, each room echoing with memories. I found myself in the small sewing room she had claimed as her own. There, tucked away in a drawer, I discovered a leather journal. I opened it hesitantly, flipping through pages filled with her neat handwriting. My heart clenched as I read her private words, confessions she had never spoken aloud. She worried Adrian cared only for the money we gave him. She feared he would never learn to stand on his own. She wondered if we had raised him to value wealth over love. Her final entry left me breathless. What if we gave him everything but failed to teach him love? I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Her words echoed in my mind, confirming what I had already begun to suspect. Adrian's absence at her funeral was not an accident. It was the culmination of years of choices, of neglect, of entitlement. The masquerade ball was simply the mask he had worn all his life, hiding a hollow heart. For the first time, I saw the truth without her gentle excuses to shield me. As night settled over the estate, I sat at her desk, the journal before me, and realized this was not just a son's failure to honor his mother. This was the unraveling of an entire legacy. And though I did not yet know it, what I discovered that night would be only the beginning of a reckoning that would change everything. That night the sea was restless, hammering the cliffs below our estate with a fury that seemed to echo my own. I could not sleep. The house, once filled with warmth and Eleanor's humming presence, had become a cathedral of silence. Every creak in the floorboards felt louder than usual. Every gust of wind through the chimney seemed to whisper her name. I walked the halls like a ghost, unable to rest, drawn from room to room, as if searching for her. The master bedroom smelled faintly of lavender, her favorite scent. On the nightstand, her Bible rested with a pressed daisy marking a page. I touched it gently, remembering how she had loved that flower above all others. Yet even in this room, the comfort I sought eluded me. I drifted toward the sewing room, the one place that had always been hers alone. The moment I opened the door, I felt as though I had intruded on sacred ground. Her sewing machine sat quietly beneath the window, threads of every color still neatly arranged in their drawers. Spools of navy crimson and ivory lined up as if waiting for her hands. On the corner of the desk lay an unfinished scarf, the needles still threaded, frozen in time. My chest tightened as I picked it up, wondering if she had intended it for me, or perhaps for Adrian, a final gift she never finished. It was here that I found the journal. Hidden beneath a pile of fabric, scraps bound in worn leather, it felt heavier than it should have. I sat in her chair, the one with the worn cushion shaped by years of use, and opened the book with trembling hands. At first the entries were simple notes about her garden, her friends, small joys of daily life. But as I turned the pages, her tone changed. She wrote about Adrian, about the growing fear she carried in her heart. I read the words slowly, each one like a blade cutting deeper. She confessed that she worried Adrian had come to love the money more than us. She described moments when he had taken without gratitude, when he had demanded without care. She wondered if we had failed him by giving too much. One entry stopped me cold. What if we gave him everything but failed to teach him love? I read it again and again until the words blurred. She had seen the truth long before I dared to face it. I closed the journal and leaned back the chair, groaning beneath me. The storm outside battered the windows, the wind howling through the cracks as though the world itself raged at the betrayal. I realized then that Adrian's absence at the funeral was not just a careless mistake. It was the inevitable conclusion of years of indulgence. The masquerade ball had been nothing more than another mask, another performance in a life of hollow pleasures. I sat in the sewing room until dawn, Eleanor's journal open before me, my mind racing. When the morning light spilled across the floorboards, I rose with a new sense of purpose. I walked to my study, the mahogany desk where I had built my shipbuilding empire piece by piece. There I opened the drawers filled with files, each one carefully labeled. Education, house, wedding, loans, vacations. All of it lay before me, in neat rows of paper, silent proof of a lifetime of sacrifices. I began to calculate. Tuition fees for college. $48,000 for a graduate program Adrian never completed. $350,000 for the down payment on his house. $70,000 for a wedding he barely acknowledged us at. $35,000 for a car. The numbers rose higher and higher, each figure a reminder of what Eleanor and I had given. Vacations, failed ventures, bailouts, nearly $1 million in total. I pushed back from the desk, staring at the figures with disbelief. My father had given me nothing but a stern handshake when I left home, a reminder to build my own future. I had thought myself better by giving my son everything I could. Yet here I was, staring at the ruins of that generosity. Had I built him into the man he was, or had I destroyed him by sparing him the struggle that shaped me? Among the files I discovered another notebook, this one written by Eleanor in secret. She had chronicled the sacrifices we made. Anniversary dinner canceled, she wrote, so Adrian could have money for a car repair. Doctor's visit postponed so we could send Adrian $5,000. She had written them down not with bitterness, but with quiet resignation, as if hoping one day he would understand. Her final note broke me. We gave Adrian everything. I hope he remembers us kindly. I slammed the book shut, unable to bear more. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air heavy and still. In that stillness, I felt something shift inside me. Grief hardened into resolve. I realized that if Eleanor's love had been unable to save Adrian from himself, then nothing I could give him now would change the man he had become. He was not a boy in need of help anymore. He was a grown man who had chosen his path. I returned to the bedroom, journal in hand, and stared at the empty side of the bed where Eleanor once slept. I imagined her voice, gentle but firm, whispering what she had always feared. Maybe we are doing too much for him. For the first time, I did not dismiss her words. I let them take root. The following morning, the phone rang. Adrian's name flashed across the screen. My chest tightened, but I answered. His voice was bright, almost cheerful, the same tone he had used as a child when he wanted something. He asked how I was holding up, though he did not mention the funeral. Then he moved quickly to his real purpose. The masquerade had been a grand success, but they had overspent. The orchestra, the catering, the jewelry, the wine. The bills were piling up, and he needed $15,000 immediately. I listened in silence, my gaze fixed on Eleanor's photograph resting on the desk. Her smile radiated warmth, but I could almost hear her unspoken warning. Adrian's words droned on about expenses, about Celeste's stress, about how I could easily afford it. When he finally paused, I spoke one word. No. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. He laughed nervously, asked if there was an issue with the bank. Again I said no. His voice shifted sharper, now accusing me of being petty, reminding me that his mother would have wanted me to help. But I no longer felt the pull of guilt. I repeated my refusal each time, firmer than the last, until his voice broke with anger. He warned me not to expect him around much anymore. I simply replied, I understand, and ended the call. The phone sat quietly on the desk, no longer a chain binding me to his demands. For the first time in decades, I felt the faint stirrings of freedom. Yet beneath that relief lay something else, something colder. I had crossed a threshold, but the path ahead was uncertain. I walked back to the sewing room, sat in Eleanor's chair, and opened her journal once more. The words stared back at me, urging me toward the next step. I realized that what lay before me was not merely the grief of a widower or the disappointment of a father. It was the reckoning of a legacy. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the estate, I knew what I had to do. Adrian had been shielded for too long. If he would not learn through love, then he would learn through consequence. The files on my desk were not just records of the past. They would become the foundation for what came next. What I did not know then was how far that decision would carry me, and how deeply it would unravel the fragile ties that still bound us. For the first time, I was ready to face him not as a father blinded by loyalty, but as a man prepared to act with finality. And so, with Eleanor's words still echoing in my mind, I prepared for the moment that would sever the last threads of indulgence and reveal the truth in full. The morning after I first told Adrian no, I sat at my desk watching the sun rise over the harbor. The sky was streaked with crimson, as if the sea itself had bled during the night. The gulls cried overhead, circling hungrily, their voices sharp against the silence of the house. I thought about Eleanor and her journal, about the sacrifices she had written down, so carefully sacrifices Adrian had never acknowledged. The refusal I had given him yesterday was only the beginning. I knew he would not accept it. Adrian was too used to winning, too used to bending me to his will. The phone rang again right on cue. His name glowed across the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but I forced myself to answer. His voice came through bright and casual, as if nothing had happened, as if my wife's funeral had not been days ago, and he had not skipped it for a masquerade ball. He asked how I was doing, though his tone held no weight of concern. Then, almost seamlessly, he moved on to the reason for his call. The masquerade had been spectacular, he said. Everyone had been talking about it. But the bills had mounted higher than expected. The orchestra had charged more. The jeweler had refused to extend credit. Celeste was furious. They were looking at $15,000 in immediate payments. He said it as though it were nothing more than the cost of repairing a roof or buying groceries. He said it with the casual expectation that I would agree. After all, had I not always agreed? My mind went back to Eleanor's words in her journal. What if we gave him everything but failed to teach him love? I pressed my fingers against the desk until my knuckles whitened. No, I said again. There was a pause on the other end. Then he laughed softly, a hollow laugh that carried no humor. "What do you mean, no?" he asked. "Is there a problem with the bank? Do you need me to come down and help sort it out?" I repeated myself, my voice steady. "No, Adrian, I will not be giving you any more money." The shift in his tone was immediate, the cheerful mask crumbling to reveal irritation. He reminded me that his mother had just passed, that she would want him supported. He accused me of being cold, even cruel. He said he could not believe I would deny him now of all times. I let him finish, then answered with quiet finality. "Your mother wanted you at her funeral." Silence. For the first time he had no immediate retort. I imagined his face tightening, his jaw, clenching, his mind scrambling for the next angle. Finally his voice came back harsher now. "If this is how you are going to be, do not expect us to come around anymore." I closed my eyes and pictured Eleanor's face, the sadness in her eyes when she had made excuses for him. My response came with surprising calm. "I understand." Then I ended the call. For the first time in decades, I had not let him dictate the terms. The phone lay silent on the desk, no longer a weapon in his hands. I looked at Eleanor's photograph, her smile captured in a frame, and whispered, "I hope you approve." But even as I sat there, I knew this was not the end. Adrian would not let the matter rest. He would come back, not with an apology, but with another demand. He had always returned again and again, each time with a new excuse, a new need, a new crisis. He was relentless because I had taught him to be. And I knew deep down that the next request would not simply be about money. It would be about something larger, something that tested more than my wallet. The following day confirmed my fears. I was sitting in the conservatory, staring out at the sea, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. I rose heart-pounding and walked to the front hall just as the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Adrian stood there dressed carelessly, his eyes darting nervously. Beside him was Celeste, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes blazing with determination. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I stepped aside, though my instincts screamed against it. They entered the hall, their presence filling the space that Eleanor's laughter used to occupy. Adrian began with pleasantries, asking how I was holding up, but Celeste cut him off. She launched directly into her case. The masquerade had been a vital social event, she insisted. Their reputation depended on it. But now creditors were circling, and they needed assistance. Not just 15,000 this time, but much more. I remained silent, watching them both. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, his confidence slipping beneath my gaze. Celeste carried the argument, her voice rising with each sentence, as though she could overwhelm me with sheer force. She accused me of being selfish, of punishing them for enjoying life, of letting grief cloud my judgment. She even dared to invoke Eleanor's name, claiming that my wife would be ashamed of me for turning my back on my son. Her words struck me like daggers, but I refused to show it. I remembered the journal. I remembered Eleanor's quiet fears. I knew the truth. My wife had never been blind to their greed. She had simply chosen love over confrontation. But she was gone now, and I was left with the choice she had feared to make. When Celeste paused to catch her breath, Adrian finally spoke. "Dad," he said, his voice softer, almost pleading. "I know I messed up missing the funeral. I was wrong. But destroying me will not bring Mom back. Think about our family. Think about the future." The word family echoed in the hall, hollow and false. What family? Eleanor was gone. Adrian had chosen masks and music over her farewell. Celeste saw marriage as a ladder to wealth. What future did they imagine? A future built on endless handouts, on my silence, on Eleanor's sacrifices. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and saw not the boy who once held my hand as we walked the harbor, but a man who had been hollowed out by entitlement. And in that moment I felt something within me harden into stone. I told them no, not with anger, not with explanation, but with the same calm that had carried me through the funeral. I said the word as though it were the closing of a door. No. Celeste's face twisted with fury. She spat accusations, threatened legal action, even raised her voice until it echoed through the halls. Adrian stood silent, his eyes darting, his shoulders slumping. At last, when I refused to bend, they left. The slam of the door behind them reverberated through the house, shaking dust from the beams. I stood in the hall for a long time after, my breathing steady, my hands surprisingly calm. The final request had been made, and I had answered. But even as I turned back toward the conservatory, I knew this battle was far from over. Adrian had always seen my generosity as his right. He would not let go easily. And there was one arena left where our lives still overlapped, one domain where father and son were bound together, not by blood but by business. The shipyard, Harlan Shipworks. The company I had built from nothing, the company he now believed was his inheritance. I felt a chill sweep through me as I realized what must come next. The reckoning would not end at my doorstep. It would carry into the heart of the empire I had built, and it would end there once and for all. The morning I decided to confront Adrian, in the one place he could no longer hide, was colder than usual. A low fog rolled in from the sea, blanketing the shipyard in a gray veil. The cranes and dry docks stood like silent sentinels, their outlines blurred by mist. I arrived earlier than I had in years, stepping into the offices of Harlan Shipworks before the sun had fully risen. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt, a scent that had once filled me with pride but now carried the weight of dread. For decades, this company had been my life's work. I had built it from a single contract repairing fishing boats to one of the most respected shipbuilding firms on the coast. Every rivet, every plank, every sail bore the mark of my labor. Adrian had walked into it, as if it were a gift wrapped in ribbon, never earning his place, never understanding the sacrifices that had made it possible. I had excused his failures for too long, telling myself he was learning, that he would grow into the role. But the files spread across my desk told a different story. Missed deadlines, inflated expense reports, clients who no longer trusted his word, contractors who refused to work under his supervision. His name had become a liability, whispered in the corners of boardrooms, spoken with hesitation by partners who once praised us. Each file I opened was another nail in the coffin of his career, another reminder of how far I had let this rot spread. At precisely 8:45, I summoned Samuel Rhodes, my operations director, into my office. Samuel was a man of few words, his loyalty forged in years of shared labor and storms weathered together. He had seen the truth long before I admitted it. His eyes told me he was not surprised when I said the words, "It is time. Terminate his position." Samuel nodded, his voice low and steady. "I will prepare the papers. Do you want security on standby?" "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "Standard procedure." As Samuel left, I rehearsed the words in my head, practicing them until they carried no emotion, only the weight of finality. This was not a father speaking to a son. This was an employer addressing an employee who had failed. I stared at my reflection in the office window, the fog pressing against the glass, and told myself again and again that this was necessary, that Eleanor would understand. At 9:30, the sound of laughter drifted through the lobby. Adrian's voice, bright and careless, carried down the hallway. He was joking with the receptionist, making light of how late he had stayed out after the masquerade. His footsteps approached slowly, unhurried, as though he owned the place. He stopped at the coffee machine, pouring himself a cup, utterly unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift forever. I pressed the intercom. "Adrian, please come to my office immediately." His voice floated back casual. "Sure, Dad, just let me grab my coffee. Now, Adrian." The silence that followed was thick, as though he had finally sensed the change in tone. His footsteps came heavier this time. When the door opened, he saw Samuel standing by the window, papers in hand. His smile faltered. "What is this?" he asked, forcing a laugh. "Some kind of joke." I remained, seated, my hands folded on the desk. "Adrian Harland, your employment with Harlan Shipworks is terminated effective immediately." The words hung in the air like thunder. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Then he shook his head. "Very funny, Dad. Really good one. What is this about?" I slid the papers across the desk. "Please review and sign." He picked them up, his hands trembling as his eyes scanned the lines of legal text. His face grew pale, the color draining as reality settled in. You cannot be serious. This is our family business. This decision is based on your performance and conduct. I replied evenly. Your position has been eliminated. He threw the papers back onto the desk. This is about the money, isn't it? Because I asked for help after the masquerade. You are doing this out of spite. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. His voice cracked with desperation. Mom would never want this. She would want you to stand by me. I pressed the button beneath my desk, and moments later 2 guards appeared at the door. I looked my son in the eyes for the first time during that encounter and felt no tremor of doubt. This is a business decision, not a personal one. The words struck him harder than any slap. His face contorted rage and disbelief, battling across his features. He turned to Samuel, searching for sympathy, but Samuel's expression was unreadable. When the guard stepped forward, Adrian's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. He gathered his coffee mug and a framed photo of Celeste from his desk, his movements slow, defeated. "Dad, please," he whispered as they guided him out. "Think about what this means." I met his eyes and said simply, "I have." Through the window I watched as he walked across the parking lot, his box of belongings cradled like a coffin. His car door slammed, and for a long moment he sat there, his shoulders shaking. Whether it was rage or grief, I could not tell. Then he started the engine and drove away without looking back. When Samuel returned with the signed paperwork, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The hardest part was over yet. The weight of what I had done pressed heavily against my chest. I walked to the wall where the portraits of our management team hung. Adrian's photograph smiled out at me in a suit I had bought him, a smile I now saw as hollow. I removed it from the wall, placed it face down in a drawer, and stared at the empty space left behind. The wall looked cleaner, sharper, almost as though the company itself had exhaled. I told security that Celeste was never to be allowed in the building again. I knew she would come, her fury unstoppable, her voice sharp as a blade. And indeed, not an hour later, she stormed through the lobby, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. Her hair was perfect, her eyes ablaze, and Adrian trailed behind her like a shadow, his face drained of color. "How dare you humiliate him like this?" she shouted, pointing a finger at me as though she could cut me down with accusation alone. I remained seated unmoved. "This is a private workplace. You have no right to be here." "We have every right," she snapped. "This business belongs to Adrian, too. You cannot throw him out like some criminal. We demand 6 months severance at least. He has worked here for 8 years. You owe us that much." Adrian tried to speak, tried to soften the confrontation, but she silenced him with a glare. She accused me of being unstable, of taking out my grief on them, of dishonoring Eleanor's memory. Her words, sliced with precision, meant to wound, meant to provoke. I felt my jaw tighten, but I refused to let her see the cracks. When she invoked Eleanor's name, claiming my wife would be ashamed of me, Adrian finally protested. "Megan, please do not say that." But her fury was unrelenting, her voice rising until the entire office could hear. I pressed the button again. The guards returned their presence, filling the doorway. Celeste's protests grew louder, wilder, until she was escorted out by force. The sight of her struggling, shouting threats of lawsuits and vengeance became the spectacle she had intended for me. But it was she who left in disgrace, her words echoing down the corridor like a dying storm. When silence returned, Adrian stood alone in the doorway. His final attempt came softly, almost broken. "I am all the family you have left." For a moment I saw the boy he had once been running into my arms after school, his face bright with love, but the image vanished, leaving only the man before me hollowed by greed. I shook my head. "No, Adrian, you are just someone who used to be my son." He lowered his gaze, his face crumbling. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The office felt cavernous after he was gone. I sat at my desk, staring at Eleanor's photograph, wondering if she would forgive me for what I had done. But deep down, I knew she already had. She had seen this coming long before I did. She had written it in her journal, hidden it among her sewing supplies, waiting for me to find the truth. And though the hardest part seemed over, I knew this was not the end. Severing blood ties in the boardroom was only the first step. The real battle would unfold in the quiet chambers of law and legacy, where names on paper determined who would inherit the future. That was where I would go next. The afternoon after I severed Adrian from Harlan Shipworks, I sat in my study with Eleanor's journal open before me. The house was still the kind of silence that pressed down like a weight. My hands rested on the worn leather cover, and I traced the grooves of her handwriting as if touching her voice. Her fears about Adrian, her doubts about what we had given him, echoed through my mind. She had seen what he would become long before I did. Now her words guided me toward a decision that felt both impossible and inevitable. It was not enough to fire him. His entitlement stretched beyond business. He believed the estate, the company, and every coin I had ever earned belonged to him by right. He spoke of inheritance as if it were already his, as if my life's work existed only to fund his pleasures. For years I had allowed that illusion to grow unchecked. Eleanor's death had stripped away the veil. If I did not act now, everything we had built together would be devoured by him and his wife. That evening I called an old friend, the one man whose judgment I trusted completely. Marcellus Graves had been my attorney for 2 decades. He had overseen every contract, every land purchase, every expansion of the shipyard. More than that, he had been at our table, shared meals with Eleanor, and mourned with me at her funeral. If anyone could help me forge a new path, it was him. Come tomorrow, I told him. There are changes I need to make. The next afternoon I walked into Graves & Associates, a towering glass building overlooking the harbor. The lobby smelled of polished wood and leather, the quiet hum of professionalism settling around me like armor. Marcellus greeted me in his corner office, where the floor-to-ceiling windows cast a panoramic view of the sea. His expression softened when he saw me. "How are you holding up, Victor?" he asked gently. I declined his offer of coffee and sat across from him. "I need to make changes to my estate." "Of course," he said, pulling out a notepad. "Updating beneficiaries after Eleanor's passing is common." "No." My voice was steady, firmer than I expected. "I am removing Adrian entirely." The words landed heavy between us. Marcellus's pen stilled. His brows furrowed. "Victor, this is no small step. What has happened?" I told him everything. Adrian skipping the funeral for a masquerade ball. The phone calls demanding money days after burying Eleanor. His reckless mismanagement of the company, his sense of entitlement, his wife's venom. Marcellus's expression darkened with each detail, but he said nothing until I finished. Then he nodded slowly. "You are certain, more certain than I have been of anything in years." I laid out my vision. The Eleanor Harland Foundation, a trust dedicated to education for orphans, grants for maritime research funding for causes Eleanor had cherished. Her legacy would live not in Adrian's extravagance, but in opportunities for others. Scholarships instead of shopping sprees. Research instead of reckless debts. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a flicker of peace. Marcellus leaned forward, his eyes sharp now, no longer the sympathetic friend but the calculating lawyer. "Then we will make it ironclad." He began sketching the framework. The company assets would move into an irrevocable trust, protecting them from lawsuits or claims. Insurance beneficiaries would be changed. Retirement funds redirected. The house itself would eventually be sold, its proceeds donated. The only item excluded, I told him firmly, was Eleanor's wedding ring. It would be buried with me. Marcellus paused, only once his voice careful. "What about Adrian's childhood belongings?" "Donate them," I replied, without hesitation. "I am removing him from my life entirely." We spent hours drafting documents. Each page I signed carried the weight of finality, yet my hand did not tremble. 2 witnesses from the firm joined us, ensuring the legality of every step. Adrian was disinherited not just from the company, but from every future claim. He and any descendants were barred, their names struck clean from the legacy I had built. Marcellus read through each clause aloud. Power of attorney documents removing Adrian's authority. Medical directives excluding him from healthcare decisions. A living will ensuring he could not interfere. Each safeguard was a wall erected between us, each signature another stone in the barrier. When the last paper was signed, Marcellus sat back in his chair studying me. You understand, Victor, this takes effect immediately. There is no turning back. I met his gaze with steady resolve. There is nothing to turn back to. Before I left, I gave one final instruction. Adrian is to receive formal notice of this change, not from me, from you. I want it delivered with the weight of law, not the plea of a father. As I stepped out of the office, the late afternoon sun cast golden light over the harbor. Ships moved slowly across the water, their sails catching the wind. I thought of Eleanor's smile, her laughter in this very city, her dreams for the future. For the first time since her passing, I felt I was honoring her instead of failing her. Yet even as peace brushed against me, I knew the storm was not over. Adrian would learn soon enough, and his reaction would not be silence. He would rage, he would threaten, he would twist every word until he convinced himself he was the victim. But the foundation was set both literally and figuratively. My resolve was no longer fragile. That evening, as I sat alone in the conservatory with Eleanor's photograph, my phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from Adrian. A voicemail blinking. I deleted them without listening. The ties were cut. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I braced myself. Because if there was one thing I had learned about my son, it was that he never surrendered quietly. The news traveled faster than I expected. In a town like ours, whispers were stronger than waves and secrets could not be contained. By the end of the week, Adrian's absence at his mother's funeral had become more than a private shame. It was a story retold in parlors, whispered across pews in church, and dissected over coffee at the country club. No matter where I went, I could feel the shift, as if the entire community had decided that the Harland family was no longer united. It began innocently enough. At the monthly board meeting of the Davenport Club, William Hayes, the president, clasped my hand warmly and offered condolences. The memorial service was beautiful, Victor, he said. Eleanor would have been proud. But then, as the meeting unfolded, Florence, my sister-in-law, leaned toward me with her eyes sharp as glass. I kept looking for Adrian at the service, she whispered. Where was he? I felt the room still around us. The other board members glanced in our direction, waiting for my answer. For years I had protected him, making excuses, weaving lies to cover his negligence. But something inside me had shifted since signing those papers in Marcellus's office. The time for excuses was over. He chose not to come, I said plainly. He was hosting a masquerade ball instead. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. William's face darkened. Florence gasped. Around the polished table, expressions tightened with shock then, with something harsher, disgust. In Davenport, loyalty to family and respect for the dead were sacred values. Adrian had violated both. By evening, the story had already spread beyond the boardroom. William's wife carried it to her bridge club. The club passed it along to neighbors. Within hours, Adrian's choice was the talk of the town. I did not have to lift a finger. The truth carried its own weight. The first blow landed on Celeste. At her exclusive yoga studio, she was asked to leave mid-session. The instructor's tone was polite, but the message was sharp. We prefer members who uphold family values. The humiliation seared her, and she stormed out, her cheeks burning. She told Adrian that night, her voice trembling with fury, that something had to be done. It did not end there. At Romano's, the upscale restaurant where Adrian had reserved a table every Friday, the manager suddenly claimed they were fully booked. At the country club, his usual golf foursome made flimsy excuses, abandoning him after the first 9 holes. He returned to his car alone, his clubs dragging behind him, the laughter of other players echoing across the fairway. Celeste fared no better. At Bergdorf's boutique, where she had been treated like royalty for years, the clerk's smiles turned thin. Her platinum credit card application was mysteriously delayed. The manager suggested she might prefer to shop elsewhere. By the time she returned home, tears streaked her face and rage poured from her lips. Adrian, she spat, this is your fault. Church brought no comfort either. During Sunday, service heads turned as they entered. Conversations hushed. When Celeste attempted to sit among her usual circle of friends, the women shifted away, leaving her isolated. Adrian tried to hold his head high, but the weight of the stairs bore down on him. Even the local newspaper joined in. The society columnist wrote a short but cutting piece noting the unfortunate absence of the Harland heir at his mother's farewell. It was enough to cement the story as fact. Adrian could no longer deny it. His absence was not just a family failure. It had become a public disgrace. At home, the pressure boiled over. Celeste paced their living room heels, striking the floor with sharp, angry clicks. Do something, she demanded. Fix this. Everyone is laughing at us. You have ruined everything. Adrian tried to soothe her, but his words fell flat. He muttered about exaggerations about how people would forget. But deep down, he knew they would not. In a town like Davenport, reputation was currency, and his had been spent. The humiliation cut deeper each day. At the Chamber of Commerce, luncheon conversations stopped when he approached. Old business partners avoided his eyes. Job interviews he had arranged were abruptly canceled. Former allies no longer returned his calls. Even his golf club membership came under review, the board citing his failure to uphold the standards of community leadership. Celeste's fury grew unbearable. She accused him of weakness, of letting me control the narrative, of failing to protect their status. She threatened to leave if he did not fix it. Adrian lashed out in turn, blaming me, blaming the town, blaming anyone but himself. Their marriage, once gilded with wealth and appearance, began to fracture under the weight of disgrace. From my vantage point, I heard pieces of their unraveling through friends, neighbors, and the subtle murmurs of a small town. Each new humiliation was carried back to me, like waves breaking on the shore. And though part of me felt satisfaction, another part felt only the inevitability of justice. Adrian had sown arrogance and neglect. Now he reaped isolation, but I knew the worst was yet to come. Social exile was painful, but it was survivable. Money could still shield them, at least for a while. As long as Adrian had a roof over his head, as long as Celeste had her designer heels, they could cling to illusions of superiority. To break those illusions completely, something more was required. That moment arrived one morning when the bank called. Mr. Harland, the manager's voice said with careful formality, Adrian's mortgage is now 60 days overdue. Since you are still listed as guarantor, we need your immediate response. I sat at my desk, Eleanor's photograph beside me, her eyes steady and kind. The time had come to finish what I had started. I scheduled a meeting with the bank manager for the following day. There, in the shadow of the Mississippi River, where barges carried the fruits of honest labor, I would sever the final tie. Adrian's social world had already collapsed. Soon his financial world would follow. And when both were gone, stripped bare of illusion, he would be forced to face what he truly was. The reckoning was not over. It had only begun. The next morning I walked through the marble lobby of First National Bank with a calm I had not felt in weeks. The polished floor gleamed beneath the tall windows, reflecting the portraits of Davenport's founding families. Men who had built their fortunes with grit and sacrifice seemed to watch me from their gilded frames, their stern faces approving of what I was about to do. David Harrison, the bank manager, rose from behind his desk as I entered his office. His voice carried unease as he gestured toward the documents spread out across the polished mahogany. Adrian's mortgage, his personal loans, his credit accounts, an entire life propped up by debt and guaranteed by my signature. Thank you for coming, Mr. Harland, David began carefully. Adrian's mortgage is now 60 days delinquent. The total outstanding is $18,400. Since you are the guarantor, we were expecting your payment. I remained perfectly composed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I understand, I said, but I will not be covering this or any future payments. David's face went pale. He leaned back, blinking in disbelief. "Forgive me, sir, but you have guaranteed this loan for 8 years. If you withdraw, we will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." "That is precisely what I expect," I replied. "Here are the documents prepared by my attorney. They fulfill the 30-day legal notice required for withdrawal of guarantee." He picked up the papers, his hands trembling slightly. Through the speakerphone, the bank's legal counsel confirmed what I already knew. My withdrawal was absolute, final, and perfectly lawful. David exhaled slowly, the weight of consequence settling over him. "Then foreclosure it will be." I stood, my voice steady. "Please expedite the process." Leaving the bank, I felt the Mississippi breeze brush against my face. Barges moved slowly across the water, carrying cargo toward destinations unknown. I thought of Eleanor and how she would have approved. We had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to see our legacy wasted on greed. Justice was not cruelty. It was simply the harvest of truth. Across town, Adrian and Celeste's lives began to collapse with startling speed. Their credit cards were frozen, their utilities disconnected. I heard from acquaintances that one evening they sat in darkness, candles flickering weakly in the grand rooms of their mansion, their laughter replaced by bitter arguments. Celeste's voice carried through thin walls, sharp with accusation. "This is your fault," she told him. "You let your father destroy us." Adrian tried to protest, but his words faltered. For the first time, he faced the reality of a life stripped of privilege. They held garage sales, selling possessions once flaunted at parties. Guests who had once praised their taste now drove past without stopping, watching from their car windows as jewelry, golf clubs, and designer gowns were sold for pennies. The humiliation burned deeper than any wound. But the true reckoning came 6 months later when the foreclosure auction was held on the courthouse steps. I parked my black sedan across the street and watched as a small crowd gathered. Investors murmured to one another, waiting for the auctioneer to begin. The morning air was crisp sunlight glinting off the courthouse's stone facade. Adrian and Celeste stood apart, their faces pale, their postures stiff with desperation. Celeste's eyes were red mascara streaked across her cheeks. Adrian clutched a folder of papers, though I knew it was useless. The house was gone the moment I withdrew my guarantee. The auctioneer raised his voice, reading out the legal description with bureaucratic precision. Opening bid $280,000 for this 4-bedroom colonial. A woman in a navy suit lifted her hand. Another bidder countered. The price climbed slowly, each number another nail in Adrian's coffin. He whispered urgently to Celeste, his eyes darting from bidder to bidder. When the woman in navy persisted, his expression shifted from hope to fear. That woman was Sarah Mitchell, my trusted secretary, acting as agent for a holding company I had arranged through Marcellus. Every detail had been planned. Every step had been calculated. 317,000, Sarah called. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel struck, sealing their fate. Celeste's scream pierced the morning air. "This is our home." She lunged forward, but courthouse security held her back. Adrian staggered his legs, nearly giving out. He turned and saw me standing across the street. In that instant, realization dawned on his face. His father had orchestrated every step of this downfall. I crossed the street slowly, each footstep deliberate. Adrian's eyes locked on mine, burning with a mixture of rage and despair. "How could you do this to us?" he rasped. I stopped a few feet away, my voice calm. "I did not do anything, Adrian. The bank did." He shook his head violently, his voice breaking. "You know what this means. We have nowhere else to go. Mom would never forgive you." My chest tightened at the mention of her, but I did not waver. "Your mother is not here to see what you have become." Celeste shouted accusations, wild and venomous, calling me abusive, unstable, vengeful. She claimed she would sue, that the law was on her side. But her voice was shrill, her threats empty. Security led her away as she thrashed against their arms, her words scattering like ashes in the wind. Adrian remained, his eyes filled with something I had never seen before, not arrogance, not anger, but a hollow kind of despair. He whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "What happens to me now?" I looked at him, the man who had once been my son, and delivered the only truth left. That is for you to decide. I turned and walked away, leaving him on the courthouse steps. His world collapsed, his wife's screams fading into the distance. 2 weeks later, the moving truck arrived at what had once been their mansion. I stood in my car across the street, watching as neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Celeste hurled clothes into suitcases, her fury burning hot until the very end. Adrian carried boxes in silence, pausing once to wrap his mother's old crystal vase with care. Perhaps it was the only thing left that connected him to her. By evening, the house stood empty. The Ramirez family, chosen through the foundation, would soon move in, filling it with laughter and gratitude. I imagined Eleanor's smile, knowing the home she once loved would not be wasted. But as I drove away, I knew Adrian was not finished. Pride may have been stripped away, but desperation was a powerful fuel. He had lost his status, his wealth, and his home. Now he would face the world bare, and I wondered what kind of man would emerge from those ashes. The reckoning had reached its climax, but the story was not yet complete. Because when the world finally turns its back, when even pride cannot shield you, a man has only two choices: to change, or to descend further into ruin. And I suspected I had not yet seen the end of Adrian's descent. After the foreclosure, Adrian and Celeste drifted into the shadows of Davenport like ghosts no one wanted to see. Their names, once spoken with admiration at garden parties and charity galas, became whispered warnings. Friends who had dined at their table now crossed the street to avoid them. Former allies who had once begged for their company pretended not to notice them in public. They moved into a small apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town, far from the manicured lawns and seaside estates they had once called home. The space smelled of detergent and damp clothes, the constant hum of machines, a reminder of how far they had fallen. Celeste hated it immediately. She threw her designer heels into the corner, screaming that she had not married into the Harlan family for this. Their days became a blur of arguments and silence. Celeste blamed Adrian for everything. For losing the house, for allowing me to control the narrative, for failing to provide the life she believed she deserved. Her voice grew sharper with each passing day, her patience thinner. Adrian, once so certain of his place in the world, shrank under her fury. He spent hours staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. Jobs did not come easily. Word of his disgrace had spread through every channel. The shipyard no longer welcomed him, and other companies knew better than to take on the man who had abandoned his mother's funeral. At last he found work at a gas station on the highway. The uniform smelled of oil, and the hours were long. For minimum wage, he cleaned restrooms, pumped fuel, and carried boxes heavier than his pride could bear. Celeste could not tolerate it. One evening after another, screaming match, she confessed she had been speaking with an old flame, a man who owned a chain of restaurants. His wealth was secure, his reputation unblemished. She packed her bags and left her final words slicing through Adrian like a blade. Your father was right about us. Alone now, Adrian walked through the empty apartment like a ghost. He found Eleanor's vase, the one he had saved from the moving truck, and placed it on the windowsill. For the first time in years, he wept without restraint. But tears did not mend what he had broken. They only stained the silence. I heard pieces of his downfall from acquaintances, from whispers carried back to me at the club or the diner. I did not seek the information, yet it always found me. One evening, as I sat in the conservatory with Eleanor's photograph, I learned that Celeste had remarried within months. She stood proudly at the arm of her new husband, her smile wide, her disgrace erased. Adrian, however, had become invisible. Then came the night he returned to my doorstep. It was late autumn, the air sharp with frost. I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive and saw his shadow through the glass of the front door. For nearly a full minute he hovered, his hand poised above the bell as if unsure whether to press it. At last the chime rang through the house. I opened the door but did not invite him inside. He stood before me thinner than I remembered, his clothes wrinkled, his face pale. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in the space of 6 months. Dad, I know I messed up, he began, his voice trembling. I have made terrible mistakes. I see that now. He spoke of his life above the laundromat of Celeste, leaving him of the gas station job that barely kept him fed. He claimed he understood the value of sacrifice now that he wanted to change. He begged for forgiveness, for another chance for the father he believed he had lost. But as he spoke, I recognized the patterns. The same tone, the same pauses, the same rehearsed words he had always used when he wanted something. His eyes searched mine not for love but for weakness. "When is your mother's birthday?" I asked suddenly. He hesitated, then guessed. June 15th. Wrong. Eleanor had been born in April. What was her favorite flower? Roses, he answered. Wrong again. She had loved daisies, simple and unassuming, a flower he had never once thought to bring her. My heart sank as I realized he had never truly known her, not in the ways that mattered. His words about regret and change were just that, words. The same manipulations wrapped in a new disguise. At last he admitted what he had come for. He was facing eviction. He needed help. Just a small loan, he promised, just until he found his feet. His eyes filled with desperation, but behind the desperation was the same entitlement I had seen my whole life. "Mom would be heartbroken to see us like this," he said, his voice breaking. "She always believed in second chances." I stepped away and retrieved Eleanor's hidden journal from the nightstand. I opened it to the page that had haunted me since the night I first found it. I read her words aloud. "I am worried Adrian only loves our money. What if we have raised a child who cannot love?" His face went white. His lips parted, but no words came. He stared at me as if the ground had given way beneath his feet. "Margaret died knowing what you really are," I said calmly. "She changed her will before she passed. She left you nothing because she knew you would waste it." His mask shattered. Rage twisted his features. He shouted threats, claimed he would contest the will, accused me of senility, of cruelty, of betrayal. His final words burned in the cold night air. "I hope you die alone in this house." I stepped back and closed the door quietly, his fists pounding against the wood as I walked away. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on the stove and made tea as if nothing had happened. His pounding eventually faded, replaced by the sound of his car revving angrily down the lane. For the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt an odd peace settle over me. The door had been closed, not just on him, but on decades of guilt, of excuses, of enabling. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the mantel and whispered, "It is finished, my love." And yet, even as I spoke those words, I knew it was not finished entirely. Adrian had been stripped of wealth, of status, of love. But I wondered what would remain when all else was gone. Would he finally face himself, or would he sink further into bitterness and ruin? The question lingered in the stillness of the house, heavy as the tide pressing against the cliffs below. The winter after Adrian stormed away from my doorstep passed in silence. Snow blanketed the cliffs, the sea roared against the frozen rocks, and I lived alone in the great house with only Eleanor's memory for company. Yet I was no longer tormented by grief or anger. For the first time in many years, I felt clarity. I poured myself into the Eleanor Harland Foundation. The work became my lifeline, each meeting, each letter of thanks, each scholarship awarded a reminder that her spirit had not vanished. 20 students received funding for their education that first year. Orphans who might never have dreamed of university were given a chance. Grants went to maritime research, fueling projects Eleanor had once championed. Her name appeared on plaques in classrooms and research centers, and with each one I felt as though she were still here guiding me. The community responded warmly. At church gatherings, neighbors approached me, not with pity but with admiration. At the country club, members nodded with respect when I spoke of the foundation's work. The board of trustees grew with talented, passionate people, and together we created something that carried Eleanor's love far beyond the walls of our home. Adrian remained in Davenport, though he was no longer part of its society. He worked at the gas station on Route 6, wearing a uniform stained with oil. Sometimes I heard about him from acquaintances. Sometimes I saw him myself passing by as he carried boxes or swept the pavement. The once proud heir of the Harlan name had become a figure of quiet shame. One year after Eleanor's passing, I visited her grave with a bouquet of daisies, the flowers she had loved most. The cemetery was bright with spring birds singing from the branches of oak trees overhead. I knelt before the polished granite stone, brushing snowmelt from the letters carved into its surface. My love, I whispered, the foundation is thriving. 20 scholarships in your name. 200,000 donated to cancer research. The community center will open on your birthday. I paused, feeling the wind shift around me. Adrian is working at a gas station. His divorce is final. He lives alone. There was no satisfaction in the words, only a sense of balance. Justice, not vengeance. I arranged the daisies carefully, then walked back toward the town with a lighter step. Later that week, I stopped for coffee at the Morning Glory Diner, a small place tucked near the harbor. I had not planned to see him, but fate placed him there. Adrian stood behind the counter in his uniform, wiping down tables. His eyes lifted, and when they met mine, shock crossed his face, followed by shame. He approached cautiously, his voice low. "How are you, Dad?" "I am well," I said. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know sorry is not enough," he admitted. "I understand now what I lost. It was never about the money. You wanted me to love you, not your wallet." His eyes glistened with tears, and for the first time I believed they might be real. "I did what I had to do," I answered simply. "Your mother would have approved." "Yes," he whispered. "She would have." For a long moment silence stretched between us. Then he asked, "Is there any way back?" I considered his face worn and tired, the arrogance stripped away. "I do not know," I said honestly. "Perhaps, but not with words. If you want redemption, you must show me through actions." He nodded slowly as though he understood. The conversation ended there, but something shifted. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was no longer complete rejection either. That evening I drove past the house that had once been his. The Ramirez family lived there now, their children playing in the garden Eleanor had loved. Laughter spilled through open windows, and I felt at peace knowing the home had been reclaimed by gratitude instead of greed. In the months that followed, my life grew fuller than I ever expected. I volunteered at the new community center. I shared meals with the Johnson family, whose daughter was one of the first scholarship recipients. And slowly, gently, I began seeing Grace, a kind widow from church, who understood loss and carried her own quiet strength. On quiet nights, I sat in the garden, pruning Eleanor's roses, feeling the sunset on my face. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt alive again. One evening, as the waves rolled softly against the cliffs, I whispered into the stillness, "It is finished, my love." Justice was served not through vengeance, but through the hard choices that protected what mattered. Love had demanded sacrifice. It had demanded truth. And in the end, I had honored you. That night, I slept soundly, dreaming of Eleanor smiling, her voice clear and gentle. "You did the right thing, Victor. I am proud of you." This story is not only about betrayal and justice. It is about the dangers of enabling, of giving too much without asking for responsibility in return. Love is not measured by how much we hand over, but by the values we teach, the character we build, and the legacy we leave behind. Victor Harlan discovered too late that generosity without limits can create weakness instead of strength. Yet through loss, he also found clarity, purpose, and peace. It reminds us that family is not defined by blood alone, but by loyalty, respect, and love. And sometimes the hardest act of love is to let go so that truth and justice can take root. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video, share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps keep these stories alive.